Well, now, welcome back. Tonight we're going to slip into a very particular memory of America, a time when the meaning of being rich wasn't always about dollars in the bank. Sometimes it was the sight of a second car in the driveway, a shiny new color television, or even just a freezer in the basement stocked with ice cream. These things whispered of comfort, status, and possibility. But let's not pretend it was all glamour. For every family with an in-ground pool, there were plenty making do with hand-me-down coats and patched-up furniture. The gap between having and not having could be felt in the smallest details, sometimes painfully so. If you enjoy these quiet journeys, I'd be happy if you liked or subscribed, but only if it feels right. And tell me in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it there? I love seeing the little web of voices we share across the world. Now, settle in. Let's walk together through a time when wealth showed itself in the simplest, strangest ways. You could usually tell which families had money before you even stepped through the door. It was in the little things you noticed from the curb: a tidy driveway that always seemed freshly graveled, flower beds trimmed and blooming, shutters painted in colors that actually matched. It was not about having a mansion or anything close to it, because most homes in small towns looked quite similar. The difference showed itself in how carefully everything was kept, and whether the house gave off a sense of comfort rather than just shelter. I remember walking past certain homes on my way to school and thinking they looked almost too perfect, like they had been lifted from a magazine page. Even the cars in those driveways seemed shinier, somehow. They didn't have rust spots along the edges, and their chrome gleamed in the sunlight. It was not jealousy, exactly. It was more of a quiet recognition that some folks had a little extra, and that little extra showed itself before you even knocked on the front door. Inside the house, one of the surest signs of comfort was wall-to-wall carpeting. Most of us grew up with wood floors or linoleum that stayed cold no matter how many rugs Mama put down. Stepping into a home where every room was covered in soft, thick carpet felt like walking into another world. It seemed to swallow sound and gave the house a hushed, cozy feeling. You could sit right on the floor without your legs sticking or your socks gathering dust. I still remember the first time I wiggled my toes in a friend's shag carpet, sinking down almost like grass after a summer rain. To us, that carpet meant more than just comfort. It was a statement. It showed that a family could afford both the cost of the carpet and the upkeep it demanded. Vacuum cleaners weren't cheap either, and you had to own one if you wanted to keep that plush floor looking nice. Those little details whispered that a family had enough to spend not only on what they needed, but also on what made life easier and more pleasant. Another sign that a family had done well for themselves was seeing two cars parked in the driveway. Most homes made do with one, and that one car was often shared between the father who needed it for work and the mother who used it for errands or church. So when you passed a house that had a shiny sedan out front and another tucked safely into the garage, it caught your eye. To a child, it looked like the ultimate freedom. Imagine not having to wait your turn, not having to plan every trip around whether the car was home or gone for the day. I can still picture the neighbor who had a sky blue car with polished chrome, while a second darker one sat right alongside it. On summer evenings, both cars would gleam under the streetlights as if they were proud of themselves. There was a sense that the family had not just made it, but had given themselves breathing room, the ability to live with a little less worry. Even if we didn't say it out loud, everyone noticed. It was a quiet signal that spoke louder than any words could. If there was one thing that truly made a family stand out in the neighborhood, it was a color television. Most of us grew up with black and white sets, and even those felt like treasures in the living room. But walking into a house where the screen glowed with color was like stepping into the future. Programs like Bonanza came alive in full shades, the horses and mountains suddenly looking real instead of gray shadows. I still remember crowding into a neighbor's living room, the kids sitting cross-legged on the floor, the grown-ups perched in chairs, just to watch the screen flicker with color. People treated it like an event, not just a show. Sometimes families who owned one would even invite others over, turning an ordinary evening into something that felt like a small celebration. The sound of the set buzzing softly, the glow of the colors in a dim room, the popcorn bowls passed around, it all made the moment unforgettable. Owning a color television wasn't just about entertainment. It was a mark that a family could afford something new, something special, at a time when not everyone could. Nothing made children whisper with awe quite like hearing that a friend's family had more than one bathroom. Most of us shared a single one with the entire household. Waiting our turn in the mornings while steam fogged up the mirror and someone banged on the door reminding you to hurry. A second bathroom felt like a miracle. It meant fewer arguments, less rushing, and a certain freedom that most families only dreamed of. I can still recall visiting a girl from school who proudly showed me their upstairs bathroom, complete with its own sink and shelves. It seemed unreal to have choices about where to wash your hands or brush your teeth. To us, it was a luxury right up there with having an extra bedroom. Even the smallest details, like fresh towels folded neatly or a new bar of soap in a separate dish, seemed like proof that life could be a little smoother if your family had enough. It was one of those quiet but powerful ways that children measured the difference between getting by and living with a touch of ease. Another sure sign of comfort in the 60s was finding a deep freezer sitting in the basement or garage. Most families got by with the freezer compartment on top of the fridge, which barely held a few ice trays and maybe a package of frozen peas. But a big chest freezer meant plenty of room for roasts, vegetables, and the new frozen dinners that were just becoming popular. I remember going to a friend's house and her mother lifting the heavy lid to reveal rows of neatly stacked cartons of ice cream sandwiches and boxes of fish sticks. It seemed endless, like a treasure chest of food that never ran out. At home, we relied on canning jars and garden produce to stretch through the winter. So the sight of a freezer full of store-bought goods looked like pure abundance. It was not just convenience, it was a sign of security. Having enough space to store food and the means to fill it told the world that your family had a little extra cushion. For children, it meant the joy of always knowing there was a cold treat waiting on a hot afternoon. Another sure sign of comfort in the 60s was finding a deep freezer sitting in the basement or garage. Most families got by with the freezer compartment on top of the fridge, which barely held a few ice trays and maybe a package of frozen peas. But a big chest freezer meant plenty of room for roasts, vegetables, and the new frozen dinners that were just becoming popular. I remember going to a friend's house and her mother lifting the heavy lid to reveal rows of neatly stacked cartons of ice cream sandwiches and boxes of fish sticks. It seemed endless, like a treasure chest of food that never ran out. At home, we relied on canning jars and garden produce to stretch through the winter. So the sight of a freezer full of store-bought goods looked like pure abundance. It was not just convenience, it was a sign of security. Having enough space to store food and the means to fill it told the world that your family had a little extra cushion. For children, it meant the joy of always knowing there was a cold treat waiting on a hot afternoon. The first time I saw an automatic dishwasher, I thought it was the most marvelous invention in the world. In my house, washing dishes was a nightly routine that everyone shared. Mama scrubbed, Daddy dried, and we kids put the plates and silverware back in the cupboards. The sink was always full after supper, and it seemed to take forever before the last pan was clean. But when I visited a friend whose family had a dishwasher, the whole ritual was replaced with the click of a latch and the hum of a machine. We stood there, peeking at the little window, waiting for the steam to rise and the sound of water rushing inside. To us, it seemed like something straight out of a science fair. The family didn't have to argue over whose turn it was to wash up, and their kitchen never seemed cluttered with greasy dishwater or towels hanging from the oven door. It wasn't just about convenience, though. It was about having the means to afford an appliance that still felt futuristic. For families like mine, It remained a dream, but it was a dream that showed us what progress and prosperity looked like, right there in the heart of the kitchen. One thing that always caught my attention when I stepped into a wealthier home was the furniture. Most of us had a mix of hand-me-downs, pieces picked up at secondhand stores, or whatever our parents could manage to buy on sale at the local shop. Sofas rarely matched the chairs, and if you had a coffee table, it was probably scarred from years of cups and homework spread across it. But then you'd walk into a house where the living room looked like a set from one of those glossy catalogs. A long sectional sofa wrapped around the corner, cushions plump and fresh, and right beside it sat a laissez-boy recliner that leaned back with the pull of a lever. I still remember the sound it made when the footrest snapped into place, almost like a sigh of comfort. Sitting in one of those chairs felt like floating compared to the stiff wooden seats we were used to. It wasn't just about comfort, though. It was the statement it made. A matching set said the family had enough to buy everything at once instead of waiting years to piece things together. It showed planning and, more importantly, it showed resources. When guests came over, they were greeted not by a jumble of worn furniture, but by a room that felt designed, intentional, even elegant. I used to sit quietly on the edge of one of those couches, running my fingers along the fabric and wondering what it would feel like to live in a place where everything matched. It gave a sense of order, of stability, and even a bit of glamour to everyday life. To a child, it was not just furniture. It was proof that some families lived in a different world, one cushioned by comfort that went beyond the ordinary. There was nothing that drew children in faster than the sight of a backyard with an in-ground swimming pool. Most of us made do with sprinklers, tin tubs, or the occasional trip to the public pool where you had to wait in long lines and share the water with half the town. But a private pool, right there in someone's backyard, seemed like the ultimate dream. I remember the first time I was invited to a birthday party at a house with one. The water sparkled in the sun, perfectly blue, and the deck chairs were neatly lined along the edge. We stood at the fence before the party began, whispering to one another that this was a house with money. It was not only the cost of putting it in, which was beyond what most families could imagine, but the upkeep. The pool always looked clean, the water clear, and there were even floating toys and rafts that looked brand new. It was more than just a place to cool off on a hot day. It was a symbol, a sign that the family had enough to afford both the fun and the luxury. We kids would jump in, splash around until our eyes burned from the chlorine, and laugh ourselves tired. Then, after towels and lemonade, we'd go home to our own yards where the hose and the spray of water over the grass would have to do. I never begrudged the families who had those pools. In a way, they gave us memories too, even if it was only for an afternoon. Still, there was no denying it. A pool in your backyard was one of the clearest marks of prosperity in that era, and everyone knew it. Back when I was growing up, a store-bought dress was something to be noticed. Most of us wore clothes sewn at home by our mothers or grandmothers, using patterns from the department store and fabric bought on sale. You could spot the hand stitching if you looked close, and sometimes the hems were let down as we grew taller. There was nothing wrong with those clothes. In fact, they carried love in every seam. But when a girl showed up to school in a crisp new dress, straight off the rack, everyone turned their head. The fabric hung differently, the colors seemed brighter, and the little details like zippers or buttons always looked finished and professional. Some of us would quietly run our fingers across the sleeve or the edge, pretending not to be impressed while knowing full well that this was something special. It wasn't only dresses either. Boys with store-bought jackets or jeans seemed to carry themselves differently, as though they knew their clothes carried a touch of status. At home, Mama often reminded us that sewing saved money and taught resourcefulness. And she was right. Yet, as a child, you couldn't help but see the difference between what came from a pattern on the kitchen table and what came with a tag from the store. To have your closet lined with store-bought clothes meant your family could afford to buy what others had to make. And in the eyes of a child, that was a sign of wealth as clear as any big house or shiny car. It was a quiet but undeniable difference, and every child felt it, even if no one said it out loud. If there was one toy that made every little girl's eyes widen with envy, it was the Barbie dream house. Most of us were lucky to own a single doll with maybe a couple of extra outfits if our mothers could sew tiny clothes out of leftover scraps. But the dream house was something else entirely. It stood tall, with little rooms and furniture that seemed to shrink the whole idea of a real home down to doll size. A girl in my class had one, and she invited us over to play one afternoon. I remember walking into her room and seeing that bright pink house standing proudly against the wall. There were miniature chairs, a tiny bedspread, and even plastic dishes set out on the table. To us, it wasn't just a toy. It was a symbol that her family could afford more than the basics. The same went for the Barbie camper or convertible, each one a little piece of luxury that most families couldn't justify. At the time, those toys carried a kind of magic, and owning them gave you instant admiration among your friends. Looking back now, I can see that much of that awe came from the way children measured one another's families by the toys they were given. It wasn't about whether you loved your doll or played make-believe with imagination. It was about what your parents could afford to set under the Christmas tree. And when someone had the full Barbie dream house, everyone knew their family was living on a level a little higher than the rest of us. One of the small luxuries that made a big impression back then was a kitchen phone with a long, curly cord. Most houses had a single telephone, often sitting on a little table in the hallway, and you had to stand in one place while you spoke. But in the homes that could afford the latest models, the phone was mounted right on the kitchen wall with a cord that stretched so far you could stir a pot on the stove while still talking. I remember watching a neighbor's mother pace around her kitchen, winding that cord around her fingers as she chatted, the receiver tucked neatly under her chin. To me, it felt like freedom, the ability to move about and keep up with household chores without being tied to one spot. It was also a mark of modern living, the kind of thing you saw in magazines where women wore neat aprons and smiled as if the phone were a lifeline of elegance. At my house, conversations were short because someone was always waiting for their turn, or the cord would not reach far enough to give you any privacy. But in those kitchens with long curling cords, the phone seemed like a bridge to the wider world. It whispered of convenience, of choice, and of having enough to afford something that was not strictly necessary but certainly enviable. Even the way it looked, bright and shiny with buttons or a polished dial, gave the room an air of sophistication. For a child noticing such things, it was another quiet sign that some families had stepped a little closer to what felt like the future. Another mark of comfort in those days was having the milkman stop by your house. Most families went to the store for milk and carried home a glass jug or a carton tucked in with the rest of the groceries. But if your family had delivery, it meant fresh bottles appeared at your doorstep in the early morning, clinking softly in their wire rack. I can still remember seeing the neighbor's porch with the little insulated box, waiting neatly by the steps, the top lifting to reveal cold bottles lined up in a row. To us, it felt almost magical, as if the milk appeared out of thin air while we slept. It was not just the milk either. Sometimes eggs or bread came with it, and on special occasions there might be cream or butter too. Having the milkman come around was more than just convenience. It meant your family had enough to pay for service, to have someone else bring to you what most of us had to fetch ourselves. It gave a house a sense of abundance, of ease, like life ran a little smoother inside those walls. I used to think the families who had milk delivered must be very rich indeed. Though looking back now, it was simply one of those small luxuries that carried weight in a child's imagination. Still, the sight of that shiny bottle top catching the morning sun told everyone in the neighborhood that this was a home with a little more. One of the most fascinating things for me as a girl was seeing a family with cupboards full of real Tupperware. At our house, leftovers were saved in empty margarine tubs or jars, whatever Mama could get her hands on that had a lid. But when I went over to a friend's home and saw neat stacks of brightly colored bowls, each with a perfectly sealing top that gave a soft little burp when you pressed it down, I knew they had something special. Her mother even hosted a Tupperware party once, with women from the neighborhood gathered around the dining table while a cheerful lady in a crisp dress demonstrated how to keep celery fresh for weeks. The clatter of lids and the sound of laughter floated through the house, and I sat on the stairs listening, wide-eyed at the idea of kitchenware being celebrated like jewelry. Owning a complete set meant you were part of something modern, part of a movement that promised convenience and freshness. In a world where waste was frowned upon, those colorful bowls stood out against the shelves, all coordinated. And even as a child, I could see the pride in the way they were displayed. It wasn't just plastic, it was progress. And not every family could afford to join in. For us, it seemed like a symbol of plenty, a little sign that your family had more than just the basics. It was household wealth, tucked quietly behind cupboard doors, and everyone who visited noticed. Take a breath. We've only scratched the surface. Subscribe to keep uncovering what's hidden. Of all the luxuries a family could boast in the 60s, nothing stood taller in my memory than air conditioning. Most of us grew up with fans in the window or a damp towel draped across our foreheads on the hottest nights. The air inside the house was thick and heavy, and sleep came only after tossing and turning for hours. But the few families with central air lived in another world. I can still remember stepping into one of those homes on a blistering summer afternoon and feeling a wave of cool air wrap around me the moment the door closed. It was like walking into a cave of relief. Their curtains barely stirred, their floors stayed dry, and no one complained of sticky sheets or sleepless nights. Children from those homes seemed calmer in July because they were not worn out from restless evenings. Even visiting for an hour felt like a treat, like being allowed into a secret paradise. For the rest of us, box fans rattled in the windows and lemonade was our only escape. Air conditioning was more than comfort, though. It was proof that a family could afford something rare and costly, something that marked them as living a step above the ordinary. For a child standing barefoot in the doorway, sweaty hair sticking to her neck, it was unforgettable. That cool blast whispered that some families had moved into the future while the rest of us were still fanning ourselves with the church bulletin. Going out to eat was another clear sign that a family had money to spare. For most of us, supper was cooked at home every night without fail. Mama stretched meatloaf, casseroles, and stews to make sure everyone was fed, and eating in a restaurant was something reserved for rare occasions like a birthday. But in certain homes, it seemed like going out was part of their weekly routine. I remember hearing classmates talk casually about having dinner at the steakhouse or stopping by the local diner after church, and it felt almost exotic. To sit at a booth, have someone else bring you a plate, and leave without washing dishes was the height of luxury in my young eyes. The smell of sizzling food drifting through the air and the clink of silverware on china gave those evenings a special shine. I recall the one time my family went out to a proper restaurant when I was a girl. My father wore his best jacket, Mama fussed over her hair, and my brother and I were told to sit up straight and mind our manners. The prices on the menu made us glance at one another, but the food tasted like a celebration. For families who could do that often, it was not just about filling their stomachs. It was about being able to afford choice, service, and leisure. To the rest of us, it marked them as folks living with a little more ease, a little more of what we thought of as wealth. Another sign that a family was doing well was when their children had private lessons. Most of us learned what we could at school or picked up skills at church or from neighbors. But when a child took piano, ballet, or swimming lessons with a paid instructor, it meant their parents had the money and the time to give them something extra. I remember watching a girl from my class walk to her piano lesson every Wednesday afternoon, carrying a shiny music book under her arm. Her fingers danced across the keys at the Christmas pageant, and we all knew she had been taught in a way most of us never could be. The same went for ballet slippers, gym bags, or even the crisp uniform of a swim team. Those things stood out, not because the children bragged, but because the rest of us recognized them as special. My parents always believed in hard work and practice, but lessons cost money, and that was not something our household could spare. So, when I saw a child with polished scales on the piano or graceful movements in the recital hall, I understood it was not just talent. It was opportunity, bought and paid for. Those lessons gave more than skills. They gave a sense of polish, of refinement, of a path that stretched further than the one many of us could see. And in a small town, that alone was enough to mark a family as fortunate. In those days, one of the clearest signs that a family had more than most was when they traveled. Vacations were not common for everyone. Most folks stayed close to home, taking day trips to the county fair or maybe a weekend at the lake. But when a family packed up their car and drove across states to see the ocean, the mountains, or even the new amusement parks, it was talked about for weeks. I remember a neighbor boy returning from a trip out west, showing photographs of himself standing beside landmarks I had only seen in school books. His family even brought back souvenirs, little trinkets with names of places printed on them, proof that they had been there. For the rest of us, those tokens felt almost magical, like they carried the dust of faraway places. At school, the children who traveled had stories to tell that none of us could match. They spoke of staying in motels with neon lights, eating in roadside diners, and seeing sights most of us only dreamed about. Traveling meant gas money, time off work, and enough saved to afford nights away from home. That alone marked a family as secure. To a child watching from the outside, it was more than geography. It was a glimpse into a wider world, a reminder that while most of us were rooted in one place, others had the freedom to pick up and go wherever they wished. A finished basement was another one of those things that made a family stand out. Most basements in small-town homes were dark, damp spaces used for storing canned goods, old tools, and the washer and dryer. The concrete floors were cold underfoot, and the single hanging light bulb gave everything a gloomy look. But every so often, you'd hear about a family who had turned that space into something entirely different. Paneled walls with a warm wooden glow, thick shag carpeting, and maybe even a little bar tucked into the corner with stools and glassware made it feel like another world. I remember going to a friend's house and stepping down into her basement, and it was like walking into a clubhouse. There was a record player spinning the latest songs, a ping-pong table set up, and couches where the older kids lounged like they owned the place. To us, it seemed like a hidden retreat, a second living room where no one had to worry about spilling a drink or scuffing the floor. It wasn't only about having more space. It was about the means to decorate and furnish a part of the house that most people left unfinished. A basement like that told the neighborhood that the family had both resources and imagination. It gave the children in that home a sense of pride. And to visiting friends like me, it felt like a taste of luxury. Back before air conditioning was common in most homes, there were families who had something almost as impressive: a whole house fan or a big attic fan. These machines were built right into the structure, often mounted high on the ceiling, and when switched on, they pulled fresh air through every room. I can still remember standing in a neighbor's hallway and hearing the steady hum above us, the curtains lifting gently at the windows, and the cool breeze moving across the house as if by magic. In our home, we relied on box fans that rattled loudly and barely stirred the air, but walking into a place with one of those giant fans felt like stepping into a different world. Even on the hottest nights, their bedrooms stayed comfortable, and they could sleep under just a sheet instead of tossing and turning. To me, it wasn't only about the comfort, though that was striking enough. It was about what it said, A family with a whole house fan had invested in something most of us only read about in catalogs. It meant they had a little more to spend, and it showed in how easily their summers passed compared to ours. Standing there in the soft breeze, I knew I was witnessing another quiet symbol of wealth, one that whispered instead of shouted but made its presence clear all the same. When I think about the bedrooms of the families who had more than most, what stands out is the furniture. In many houses, bedrooms were a mix of whatever pieces could be gathered over the years. A metal frame bed handed down from a grandparent, a mismatched dresser with one drawer that stuck, and perhaps a nightstand rescued from someone's attic. That was the way most of us lived, and no one thought twice about it. But in certain homes, you would walk into a bedroom and see a full matching set: the headboard, dresser, mirror, and even the little night tables all shared the same wood and design. The drawers slid smoothly without sticking, the mirror was clear and unspotted, and the bedspread lay across the mattress like it belonged in a catalog. It gave the whole room a sense of harmony, a feeling that every piece was chosen together, not pieced together. I remember the awe I felt when I saw a friend's room like that for the first time. It wasn't just furniture, it was a statement. A complete bedroom set meant a family had the money to buy everything at once, not little by little. It showed thought, planning, and the security to furnish a room with purpose. To me, it felt like stepping into a space that had been dreamed about and then fully realized, and it was a quiet but unmistakable sign of wealth. There was a certain kind of wonder the first time I saw a garage door open with the push of a button. At our house, you had to climb out of the car, wrestle with the heavy wooden door, and heave it up until it creaked into place. But in one family's driveway down the street, the father would simply press a small remote clipped to his visor, and the door would rise smoothly as if by magic. The first time I witnessed it, I stood frozen, mouth open, certain I had just seen something out of a science fiction film. The steady rumble of the motor, the neat way the panels folded and lifted, it felt far beyond what ordinary families had. Inside their garage, everything was orderly too. Tools hung on pegboards, bicycles stood upright in neat rows, and the concrete floor seemed swept clean. To me, it wasn't just about the convenience of staying in the car during rain or snow, though that alone seemed marvelous. It was about the sense of ease, the comfort of knowing your home could bend to meet your needs with the touch of a button. That garage door opener stood as a quiet declaration that this family lived in the modern world, while the rest of us were still tugging at stubborn handles and scraping our knuckles on splintered wood. There was something special about walking into a home where even the clock on the wall seemed to fit perfectly with everything else in the room. In our house, the kitchen clock was an old wind-up model that ticked loudly and never quite kept the right time. The numbers were worn, and the glass face was cracked from being knocked off the shelf more than once. It did its job, but it was simply practical. Yet in certain homes, you would see a wall clock that looked as though it had been chosen with care, matching the curtains, the tablecloth, or even the color of the cabinets. Some were bright and modern, with sleek lines and gold trim, while others had wooden cases polished to a shine. They were not just tools to mark the hour. They were decorations, part of a larger picture that gave the whole kitchen or living room an air of polish. I can remember sitting at a friend's table, my eyes wandering again and again to their clock that matched the drapes almost exactly. It gave the sense that someone had thought about these things, that they had the time and money to choose pieces for beauty rather than just need. To a child, those matching touches spoke volumes. They whispered of families who were not just getting by, but were shaping their homes into something graceful and complete. Another detail that marked a home as more prosperous was the kind of window coverings they had. In our house, the windows were dressed with simple roller shades or curtains. Mama had sewn herself from leftover fabric. They did their job, keeping out the bright sun in summer or holding in a little warmth in winter. But they never drew much attention. Then there were houses where the windows were framed with long, heavy drapes that swept from ceiling to floor. They were often pleated just so, lined on the back to keep the sun from fading them, and held open with matching fabric ties. When they were drawn shut, they gave the room a dark, almost hushed feeling, like a theater before the curtain rose. I remember visiting a neighbor and standing at her picture window, running my hands across the thick material, amazed at how soft it felt compared to the thin cotton at our house. Those drapes didn't just block the view or the weather, they made a statement. They showed that someone cared enough, and had enough, to decorate in a way that went beyond the practical. To a child, they lent a sense of elegance, a quiet luxury that seemed almost untouchable. Even the pets in certain families seemed to tell a story about comfort and money. Most of us had mutts we picked up from neighbors or strays that wandered into the yard and never left. They were fed table scraps, slept in the barn or on an old blanket, and were loved as much as any purebred. But there were homes where the family dog wore a sweater in the winter or had a polished collar with its name engraved on a shiny tag. I still remember seeing a poodle trotting proudly beside its owner, fur clipped in neat little puffs, with a sweater striped in red and white. It looked so different from the farm dogs that ran loose in our yard, and I could tell right away that this was a pet from a house with means. These dogs had their own beds, sometimes even a cushion placed in the living room, and they were walked on leashes rather than left to wander. To a child, that level of care felt like extravagance. It wasn't that we thought less of our own scruffy companions, but we understood the difference. When a pet was pampered with clothes, brushed until it shined, and treated like another member of the family, it meant something. It showed that a household could afford to extend its comfort and pride not only to its children and its home, but even to its animals. That, to us, was another quiet but certain mark of being well off. Holidays were always a time when the difference between families seemed more noticeable. And one of the clearest signs of wealth was the kind of treats set out at Christmas. In our house, the table held homemade fudge, popcorn balls, and ribbon candy that stuck together in a glass dish. Those sweets tasted wonderful, and they carried tradition, but when you visited a home that offered imported chocolates, it felt like stepping into another world. I remember being handed a small golden-wrapped candy from a neighbor's dish, and even before I tasted it, I knew it was something special. The wrappers shone like ornaments, each piece nestled carefully in its own little cup. The flavors were richer, the presentation more refined, and to a child it felt like eating treasure. Sometimes it wasn't imported chocolates, but a big Whitman sampler, with the guide printed inside the lid so you could choose carefully. That box alone seemed to speak of elegance. It wasn't that our simple sweets weren't loved, they were part of who we were. But chocolates from afar or boxes with gold foil carried weight, signaling that the family could afford indulgence that went beyond the homemade. It gave their holiday gatherings a sense of polish, a quiet richness that echoed in every bite. Few things caught the eye on the street quite like a station wagon with wood paneling down the sides. Most families drove older cars that rattled a bit, their paint dulled from years of use, and no one thought twice about it. But when a family rolled up in a shiny wagon with polished trim and wide seats that could carry a whole pack of children, it seemed like a moving sign of prosperity. I can still see one in my mind, parked proudly in a neighbor's driveway, the sunlight glinting off the chrome and the patterned paneling running smooth along its length. To us kids, riding in a car like that felt like adventure itself. There was room for everyone. Windows that seemed enormous, and sometimes even a rear-facing seat where you could wave at the drivers behind. On school mornings, the families who owned one would load up half the block, and we'd all chatter on the ride like it was a parade. Compared to the plain sedans most of us were used to, those wagons looked luxurious, almost glamorous, With their gleaming bodies and stylish lines, they didn't just carry a family from place to place. They announced that the family had arrived in more ways than one. To me, a station wagon with wood paneling was not just a vehicle. It was a statement that a household had the means to drive something new, something modern, and something that stood out wherever it went. Holidays at our house were filled with warmth and good food, but the table was always set simply. Mama laid out her best dishes, but they were mismatched from years of breakage and replacements, and the glasses were often just sturdy tumblers. It didn't matter to us because the laughter and the food were what made it special. But then I remember visiting a home where the holiday table looked like something out of a magazine. Crystal glasses sparkled under the light, silverware gleamed in perfect rows, and a linen tablecloth stretched smooth and white with matching napkins folded neatly at each place. There was even a centerpiece of fresh flowers, something I had only ever seen at weddings or in photographs. Sitting there as a guest, I felt almost nervous to touch anything, worried I might spill or break something so fine. The meal itself seemed to carry a different weight, as though the setting made each bite taste richer. For families who could set a table like that, it wasn't just about food. It was about presentation, about showing care and pride in what they had. To me, it was another reminder of how wealth in those days wasn't only measured in money, but in the way everyday moments, like sitting down to a meal, could be lifted into something grand. Another mark of a family's standing in those days was whether or not they owned a complete set of encyclopedias. In our house, if you needed to look something up for school, you relied on the school library or asked a teacher. We had a small dictionary, worn from years of use, but that was as far as our reference shelf went. Then I visited a friend whose family had an entire row of encyclopedias lined up neatly in their living room. The volumes stretched across the shelf in matching bindings, their gold lettering catching the light, promising answers to any question you could imagine. I remember running my hand across the spines, marveling at how complete and orderly they looked. To open one was to step into another world, pictures of faraway countries, detailed maps, explanations of things I had never even thought to ask about. It wasn't only useful for homework, though that was important. It was a symbol that the family valued knowledge enough to invest in it, and that they had the resources to pay for something that wasn't cheap. For a child, it felt almost like magic. The idea that all those facts and wonders were right there waiting on a shelf at home. In our little town, that kind of library was as clear a sign of comfort as any fancy car or carpet. Something that always made me pause as a child was walking into a living room where the sofa and chairs were covered in plastic. At our house, the furniture bore the marks of everyday living. Cushions were a little saggy, threads pulled here and there, and there was always some evidence of a spilled drink or a child climbing where they shouldn't. But in certain homes, you would see a gleaming sofa, its floral or velvet fabric sealed beneath a layer of clear plastic that crinkled whenever someone sat down. At first glance, it looked beautiful, as though it had just come straight from the showroom. But then, when you actually tried to sit, you realized it was stiff and slippery, sticking to the backs of your legs on warm days and squeaking as you shifted. Still, there was no mistaking what it meant. Plastic covers weren't there to make things prettier. They were there to protect furniture that had cost a small fortune. Furniture that was too fine to risk grape juice stains or muddy shoes. In families that could afford such pieces, protecting them was just as important as showing them off. I can recall sitting nervously on the edge of a plastic-covered chair at a neighbor's house, feeling as though I had stepped into a museum where everything was meant to be admired but never truly touched. To a child, that plastic seemed like a barrier between the ordinary world and something better, something out of reach. It was another quiet reminder that some homes lived in a different rhythm, where wealth wasn't just about owning fine things, but about guarding them so they stayed fine for years to come. Another sure sign of a family's comfort was whether or not their home had a clothes dryer. Most of us grew up with wash lines stretching across the backyard or in the basement, clothes clipped with wooden pins and flapping in the breeze or dripping slowly into a pan beneath. The scent of fresh air on clean sheets was something wonderful, but it also came with the worry of rainstorms, winter freezes, or simply not having enough space for a large wash. So when you walked into a house and heard the steady hum of a dryer, it felt like you were stepping into the future. I still remember standing in a neighbor's laundry room, watching warm towels tumble behind the little glass window, while the whole room filled with a comforting heat. It seemed incredible that clothes could be dried in an hour without ever seeing the sun. For families like mine, laundry was a whole day's chore, planned carefully around the weather and the space on the line. But for families with a dryer, it was easier, faster, and more comfortable. They didn't have to drape damp socks over radiators or haul baskets outside in bitter cold. It wasn't only about the machine itself, it was about what it represented. A dryer said that a family had the money to afford something beyond the basics, something that turned a daily chore into a smoother routine. To children like me, it looked like pure luxury, the sound of clothes tumbling away as easy as could be. Something else that caught my attention in the homes of wealthier families was the presence of thriving houseplants. In our place, Mama kept a pot or two on the windowsill, usually a geranium or a spider plant, but they struggled against drafts and often looked droopy by winter's end. The houses that had money seemed to have entire corners filled with lush greenery. Tall ficus trees stretched toward the ceiling, ferns spilled over the edges of ceramic pots, and polished leaves seemed to shine as though someone cared for them daily. I remember stepping into a living room where the air even smelled different, fresher somehow, as if the plants themselves gave life to the space. They weren't tucked away either. They were proudly displayed, hanging in macrame holders or lined neatly along wide sills. Those plants gave a sense of style, but they also said something quietly about means. Buying them, tending them, and replacing them when they wilted was not always easy. Families who could afford both the time and the expense used them to show they had a little extra. For me, standing there in a room filled with greenery felt like walking into a greenhouse. It gave the home an elegance that most of us could not manage with our single-potted plant fighting for sunlight. It was another gentle reminder that even the smallest details could signal wealth in those days, right down to how a household's plants looked in their windows. One of the clearest signs that a family had more than most was owning a movie camera. In my house, birthdays and holidays lived only in memory, and the few photographs Mama managed to take with her little box camera. But some families had a reel-to-reel camera, the kind that captured moving pictures on film. I remember being invited to a neighbor's house where they dimmed the lights and set up a screen in their living room. Suddenly, we were watching scenes from their summer vacation. There they were, walking along the beach, the children splashing in the waves, and even the family dog trotting across the sand. The images flickered slightly, the sound of the projector clicking steadily in the background, and we all sat amazed as though we had stepped into their memories. To me, it seemed like magic to see life captured not just in still frames but in motion. Those cameras and the film that fed them cost more than most families could afford, and the very act of having moments preserved in moving pictures said something about security and comfort. It also said something about pride, the desire to hold on to those days in a way that could be shared over and over. For us, it was enough to tell stories around the table. But for the families with a movie camera, those stories played out again and again on the silver screen right in their own living rooms. There was always something impressive about walking into a home and seeing a piano in the living room. Most of us did not have space for such a large piece, let alone the money to buy one. Our music came from radios or, if we were lucky, a record player spinning our favorite songs. But the families who owned a piano carried themselves differently. The instrument usually sat polished and shining, sometimes with a lace runner or family photographs arranged neatly across the top. Even if no one played it well, its very presence gave the room a certain dignity. I remember visiting a friend who lifted the bench lid to reveal stacks of sheet music, each page crisp and covered with notes I couldn't read. She pressed the keys, filling the house with bright sound that seemed to reach into every corner. It was a marvel to me, something both elegant and powerful. Having a piano meant lessons, practice, and enough space in a home to dedicate to music. It wasn't only about making melodies, though. It was a quiet statement, a sign that the family valued culture and had the resources to bring it into their everyday life. For a child like me, who tapped rhythms on tabletops and sang along to the radio, a piano was more than furniture. It was a symbol of refinement, one that set a household apart. A pause is good, but the secrets don't stop here. Something I noticed in well-to-do homes was the presence of a complete coffee service set. At our table, coffee was poured from a simple pot, sugar from a chipped bowl, and cream from whatever small pitcher was handy. It worked just fine, and no one thought twice about it. But then I visited a home where the table was set with a matching china creamer, a lidded sugar bowl, and a tray to hold them both neatly beside a gleaming coffee pot. The pieces all shared the same delicate design, flowers painted along the edges, and gold trim that caught the light. When the mother poured coffee for the guests, it felt like a ritual, each motion graceful and deliberate. The clink of the spoon against fine porcelain, the way the cream poured smoothly without a drop spilling, it all seemed so refined. To me, it wasn't just coffee being served. It was an event, a sign of hospitality carried out with elegance. Sets like that weren't cheap, and owning one meant that a family could spend money not just on what was needed, but on things that made life feel special. It showed a concern for presentation, for creating an atmosphere that went beyond necessity. To a child watching from the corner, that little creamer set said more about comfort and pride than any words ever could. Travel itself was a luxury in the 60s, but another clue that a family had money was the kind of luggage they carried. Most people made do with duffel bags, cardboard suitcases, or even boxes tied with string when they traveled. At our house, a weekend away usually meant folding clothes into whatever we had handy, with no thought for matching pieces or fine materials. But I remember watching a family load their car for a trip, and every suitcase was part of a matching set. Shiny, hard shells in a deep color, with handles that gleamed and brass locks that clicked shut with a sense of finality. Some even had little tags with initials embossed on them, making it clear that these bags belonged to someone proud of where they were headed. To a child standing nearby, those suitcases seemed almost regal, like they held treasures instead of simple clothing. They gave the impression that the family was practiced at traveling, that journeys were not just rare adventures but a part of their life. The luggage itself was a statement, polished and sturdy, meant to last years and to be seen. For the rest of us, the contrast was plain. Our trips were short, our bags were mismatched, and no one cared if they looked worn. But to see an entire matching set placed carefully into a car's trunk was to see wealth displayed quietly yet firmly. It was another reminder that comfort showed itself not only in what you owned at home, but in how you carried yourself when you left it. Another thing that stood out in certain households was the sight of monogrammed towels in the bathroom. At our place, towels were whatever Mama could find on sale, usually plain and sturdy, often faded after a season of washings. They did their job well enough, drying hands and faces without anyone thinking much about appearances. But when I visited a friend and noticed her family's hand towels, each one stitched neatly with initials, I knew I was looking at something different. The embroidery was small and precise, sometimes done in gold thread or matching the color of the bathroom tile. They were clearly not meant for everyday use. In fact, Some families kept them hanging purely for show, as though they were decorations rather than linens. I remember being afraid to even touch one, certain I would get in trouble for leaving a smudge. Those towels gave the impression of refinement, of a household that cared not just about function but about presentation. It spoke of extra time and extra money, because having a set of towels just for display was a luxury in itself. To a child, it felt almost like stepping into a hotel, where every little detail seemed polished and intentional. In those small stitches, you could read a message. This family had enough to turn ordinary things into symbols of pride and status. One of the greatest wonders of the modern home in those days was a freezer with its own ice maker. At our house, ice came from metal trays you filled at the sink, carrying them carefully so they wouldn't spill before you slid them onto the narrow shelf in the freezer. When you wanted ice, you had to twist the tray with both hands until the cubes popped loose, sometimes with a crack that sent water spilling onto the floor. It was a chore, and half the time the cubes stuck so badly you gave up. So, when I visited a family whose refrigerator produced ice on its own, I couldn't quite believe it. You opened the door, and there in the bin was a neat pile of cubes ready to scoop. No twisting, no spilling, no waiting for water to freeze. It was like living in the future. I remember standing in their kitchen, listening to the clatter of fresh cubes dropping into the tray, and thinking that it sounded like pure magic. That steady supply of ice turned every glass of soda into a treat, and it meant you never had to worry about running out. More than convenience, though, it was a mark of luxury. Machines like that didn't come cheap, and having one said a family could afford more than just the basics. For a child, it was a small marvel that spoke volumes about the quiet ways wealth revealed itself. Another sign that a family had a little more than most was the steady arrival of newspapers at their door. In my home, we picked up a paper now and then, usually the weekend edition, and we made it last, reading every article until the pages were soft and smudged. But some families had the paper delivered every single morning, neatly folded on the porch before the sun was even up. In certain homes, there was also an evening edition waiting by the time supper was on the table, and Sundays brought a thick stack with glossy inserts full of color pictures. I remember visiting a house where the father would sit down after breakfast, unfolding the pages like a ritual, the children rustling through the comics, and the mother clipping coupons from the pile. It all seemed so abundant, as though the world itself was delivered to their doorstep day after day. That steady delivery was more than a convenience. It cost money, and it spoke of families who valued being connected and could afford the subscription. To me, watching their table fill with fresh newsprint, it felt like a mark of both wealth and importance, a sign that their household had a link to the larger world that never faltered. There was something about seeing a man carry a leather briefcase that made you think of success. In our town, most fathers wore work boots and carried lunch pails, their hands rough from factory shifts or long days fixing engines. That was the way life looked for the majority, and no one thought less of it. But every now and then, you would notice a father stepping out of his car in a pressed shirt, polished shoes, and a briefcase in hand. It wasn't just the case itself, though the shiny leather and brass clasps stood out. It was the way he carried it, carefully, like it held something important. Children would whisper that his job must be in an office, that he probably sat at a desk and made decisions instead of working with heavy tools. To us, the briefcase seemed mysterious, a container of papers and secrets that belonged to a different world. I remember a neighbor who always had his tucked neatly by the door, ready for the next day. Even without knowing what was inside, the very sight of it told me his life ran on order and steady paychecks. In that small object, you could read the difference between simply getting by and being part of something larger, something we called success. Another detail that marked a family as well off was the kind of coats they wore once the cold set in. Most of us bundled up in sturdy wool or heavy canvas, coats that had been passed down from one child to the next, patched at the elbows and lined with whatever cloth Mama could sew in. They kept out the wind well enough, but they were practical and plain. Then there were the families whose mothers stepped out in coats with fur trim at the collars and cuffs, or fathers with a sleek wool coat that hung smooth and perfect. I remember walking to church one winter morning and watching the women in their elegant coats, the fur brushing softly against their cheeks as the snowflakes landed. The shine of those coats, along with gloves to match, gave the whole family an air of polish. Even as a child, I knew that fur trim wasn't about warmth alone. It was about appearance, about showing that you had enough to buy something beyond necessity. To me, those coats glowed against the gray of winter, whispering that comfort and style had found their way into that household. Birthday parties told you a lot about a family's circumstances, and nothing made that clearer than when a child celebrated at the bowling alley. Most of us had our parties at home, with cake baked by our mothers, balloons tied to chairs, and games played in the yard or basement. It was simple, joyful, and done with what we had. But when a classmate invited you to a party at the local lanes, it felt like stepping into another world. There were shiny rented shoes, flashing lights above the pins, and the sound of balls thundering down polished lanes. The birthday child's family paid for pizza, soda, and a cake big enough for everyone, and sometimes even little prizes to take home. I remember clutching my paper cup, amazed at the idea of celebrating outside the home in a place where everything cost money. The parents laughed with each other while the kids bowled and ate, and you couldn't help but notice the ease with which they handled it all. It wasn't just a birthday. It was an event, and to those of us watching, it was proof that the family had the means to make childhood feel larger than life. There was a certain elegance in homes where fondue was served. At my house, supper was hearty and practical, with stews, casseroles, or meatloaf stretched to feed everyone. But in some kitchens, I saw a shiny fondue pot set right in the center of the table, often in that avocado green or bright orange that was so fashionable back then. Into the pot went melted cheese or chocolate, and around it were bowls of bread cubes, fruit, or bits of meat ready to be dipped on long forks. The first time I was invited to a friend's home for such a meal, I hardly knew what to do. We sat around the pot, laughing as we carefully dipped and twirled our food, each bite tasting richer because of the way it was shared. It felt worldly, almost European, something far removed from the ordinary meals I knew. Owning a fondue pot meant a family had the money and interest to try new things, to entertain with flair rather than just fill plates. To me, that pot represented sophistication, a way of dining that whispered of travel and magazines, of families who had the means to chase after trends most of us only read about. Another sign that a household carried a touch of wealth was the presence of a bar cart. Most families I knew kept their bottles tucked away in a cupboard or on a high shelf, out of sight and used sparingly. But in certain homes, right in the living room or dining room, stood a gleaming cart with wheels, often gold or silver in color, holding rows of bottles, mixers, and glasses that sparkled under the light. I remember visiting a neighbor and being fascinated by the way the cart seemed to announce itself. There were tall bottles with foreign labels, crystal tumblers arranged neatly on a tray, and even a small bucket for ice that glistened when filled. The adults would gather around, talking and laughing as drinks were poured with an ease that felt practiced. To me, the whole thing looked like something from a movie, elegant and grown up in a way that ordinary cupboards never could be. Having such a cart wasn't just about enjoying a drink. It was about display, about creating an atmosphere of polish and sophistication. A family with a bar cart signaled that they had enough not only to entertain but to do so with style, a quiet luxury that children like me noticed right away. Rest your mind, you've earned it. But when the next veil lifts, be here. Subscribe. Among children, few things drew as much excitement as a pair of real walkie-talkies. Most of us made do with tin cans strung together by twine, or simply cupping our hands to shout across the yard. But when a boy in the neighborhood showed up with shiny plastic walkie-talkies, complete with antennas that extended proudly, he became the center of attention. I remember the first time I held one, pressing the button, and hearing my own voice crackle through the speaker of the other. It felt like pure magic, like holding a secret line to a friend even when they were out of sight. We spent hours running from one end of the block to the other, testing how far the voices could travel, giggling at the static and the thrill of it all. Those toys weren't cheap, and everyone knew it. They ran on batteries, too, which meant you had to keep spending money just to keep the fun alive. For families who could afford them, walkie-talkies gave their children a taste of adventure, of freedom, and of being part of something bigger. To the rest of us, they were a rare glimpse of what it felt like to play with luxury in your very own hands. Travel always seemed to set certain families apart, but what stood out even more was the kind of luggage they carried along. In our home, when we went away for a night, clothes were packed into duffel bags, grocery sacks, or whatever could be found at the moment. It wasn't anything fancy, just practical. But I remember watching neighbors load up their car with matching suitcases, firm and polished, each one the same size and color, like soldiers lined in a row. Some had shiny locks and brass corners. Others bore little tags with initials embossed proudly in gold. To a child standing nearby, those suitcases looked important, like they belonged to people who traveled often and belonged in the world beyond our town. It gave the impression that their trips weren't hurried or makeshift, but planned with order and style. Even the way they stacked them neatly in the trunk seemed to say something about pride and security. For us, travel was rare and usually messy, bags spilling open or boxes tied down with rope. But to see a family with luggage that matched, clean and proper, spoke quietly of wealth. It wasn't about the bags themselves. It was about what they represented. A life where even the small details of leaving home carried the mark of having enough. Another quiet signal of comfort was the stack of magazines you'd find neatly arranged on the coffee table. At our house, magazines were rare. Maybe Mama picked one up if there was a good recipe or sewing pattern inside. But mostly we relied on the local paper or the radio for our information and entertainment. But in the homes of families who had more, you'd see glossy covers waiting in tidy piles. Life, Good Housekeeping, Reader's Digest, sometimes even National Geographic with its bright yellow border. Those magazines opened doors to worlds far beyond our own. Pictures of faraway countries, glamorous movie stars, new kitchen gadgets, and polished advertisements seemed to shine with possibility. I remember sitting cross-legged on the floor of a neighbor's house, thumbing carefully through an issue, amazed at how colorful and polished it all looked, compared to the dog-eared books at school. Subscriptions weren't cheap, and having several arrive every month meant a steady expense most families couldn't justify. Yet for those who could, it meant a living room that felt more worldly, more in step with what was happening beyond our town. To a child like me, those magazines weren't just reading material. They were windows into a life filled with choices, travel, and elegance. And the fact that they kept coming month after month said more about wealth than words ever could. One thing that always fascinated me was when I noticed a house with outdoor lights that turned on by themselves. In our home, if you wanted the porch light shining, someone had to flip the switch. Many nights we forgot, and the yard sat in darkness until Daddy remembered and got up to turn it on. But a few houses down, there was a family whose driveway lights blinked on right at dusk, as if they had been waiting for the evening sky. It seemed like magic to me, the steady glow spreading across their walk without anyone lifting a hand. The lamps were tall and graceful, often with glass globes that cast a soft light. and they gave the property a polished look that stood out on our street. I remember pausing on the sidewalk just to watch them glow, wondering how it was possible for a light to know when the sun went down. Later, I learned it was all timers and sensors. But as a child, it felt like stepping into the future. Those lights weren't just about safety or convenience. They said something about pride, about being able to afford little details that most families went without. To me, the warm glow of those automatic lamps was another reminder that even the smallest things could mark a household as rich. Another way wealth showed itself was through the Christmas cards some families sent out. Most of us picked up a box of cards at the dime store, each with a snowy scene or a manger printed on the front, and we signed our names inside before mailing them off. They were simple and heartfelt, but plain. Then there were the families who sent photo cards. I remember the first one we ever received. It showed the whole family smiling in matching outfits. The picture printed neatly with a holiday greeting right below. To us, it seemed extraordinary. It wasn't just a card. It was a keepsake, something you held onto long after the season ended. Having professional photos taken and then printed onto cards cost more than most families could manage. But for those who could, it was a chance to share not only their greetings but their image. Proof of their prosperity and togetherness. I recall Mama holding one in her hands, studying the glossy paper and the sharp details of the photograph, and saying softly, "Well, that's something." For me, as a child, it was one more reminder that even in something as small as a Christmas card, you could see the difference between families who had enough and those who were still making do. Even the smallest household items could show a family's standing. And one that left an impression on me was the cordless razor. In my home, my father shaved with an old safety razor, the kind that required blades to be changed and a steady hand to avoid nicks. The sound of him running it across his face in the morning was familiar, accompanied by the smell of shaving soap and the sight of a worn brush. But then I visited a neighbor's house and saw the father with a shiny new electric razor, buzzing away without water, soap, or fuss. It seemed incredible that something so ordinary could be done with such ease. The hum of that little machine filled the room, and he was finished before I even realized he had started. Later, when Harold bought one for himself, I remember the pride in his face as he set it on the dresser, polished and modern. That razor was more than a tool. It was a symbol of comfort, of stepping into the world of convenience and progress. To families who could afford such things, it was another way of showing that their lives ran a little smoother than most. To me, it was a quiet but clear reminder that even a morning shave could carry the mark of wealth. Sunday dinners were important in nearly every home I knew, but how they looked could reveal a lot about a family's means. At our table, the meal was hearty and full, but it was served on whatever dishes we had, with mismatched glasses and simple cloth napkins, if any at all. The food itself was the star, with roasts or casseroles filling the air with comforting smells. Yet when I visited families who had a little more, I noticed how the setting changed the whole experience. Their tables were covered with smooth linen cloths, pressed and spotless. Napkins weren't tucked into a drawer or folded hurriedly on a plate. They were folded neatly, sometimes even in shapes, and held in little rings that glistened under the light. The silverware was polished, the plates all matched, and a centerpiece of flowers or candles often sat in the middle, giving the meal a sense of ceremony. Eating there felt different. It wasn't just nourishment, it was presentation, an occasion every week. That kind of care, with linens and polished settings, required both money and time, things not every family could spare. To me, those Sunday tables carried a message. They whispered that comfort reached beyond the food itself into the way it was shared, and that a little extra meant even ordinary meals could shine like celebrations. Another quiet sign of wealth in those days was the kind of fireplace a family had. At our house, warmth came from whatever was practical: In the early years, it was a clunky old gas heater that sat in the corner of the living room, humming and clicking as it pushed out heat that never seemed to reach the farthest rooms. Before that, we used wood stoves that did their job well but left soot on your hands if you touched them, and they filled the air with a smoky smell that clung to your clothes. Those stoves were steady and dependable, but no one mistook them for pretty. They were about survival, about making sure the pipes didn't freeze, and your breath didn't hang in the air while you ate supper. They kept us warm enough, but they were plainly practical, nothing more. Then there were the homes that felt altogether different. Families who had a real fireplace in the living room seemed to live in another world. The fireplaces themselves were wide and inviting, framed by polished mantels and sometimes faced with stone or smooth brick that looked as if it had been chosen from a catalog. The mantels were never bare. They held photographs in polished frames, little clocks that ticked gently in the background, or vases filled with flowers when the season allowed. Some had heavy iron screens with fancy designs, while others kept brass tools standing neatly to one side, gleaming as though they were used more for display than for work. Everything about those fireplaces spoke of comfort that went beyond need, a kind of luxury that lifted an ordinary living room into something grand. I remember visiting one such home during the holidays. We had walked through the cold, our boots crunching on the snow, and when the door opened, a wave of warmth and light poured over us. The fire glowed softly behind the screen, sending shadows dancing across the walls. The mantel above it was lined with candles, garlands of evergreen, and even a small ceramic village that sparkled in the firelight. To me, it was like stepping straight into the pages of a Christmas card. The smell of pine and wood smoke hung in the air, mixing with the scent of cookies fresh from the oven, and the room itself seemed to sigh with comfort. The children settled on the rug with cocoa in their hands, their cheeks pink from the cold, while the adults leaned back in chairs and let the firelight do the talking. There was a quiet rhythm to it all, a sense that the fireplace was not just part of the house but the very heart of it. Even when there wasn't a fire burning, those fireplaces gave the room a feeling of richness and ease. The empty grate held promise, a reminder that warmth and beauty were waiting whenever the family wished. Guests gathered near them almost by instinct, drawn to the mantel as though it were a stage that told the story of the household. It wasn't just about heating a room. It was about creating an atmosphere, one where comfort was displayed as much as it was felt. Families who had them seemed to gather there naturally, their conversations softer, their laughter echoing warmly under the glow. To a child like me, it felt like stepping into a storybook where homes were elegant, lives were polished, and winters held a glow that never quite touched my own drafty rooms. That kind of fireplace was more than bricks and wood. It was a symbol. It represented a life that had space for beauty as well as warmth, for gatherings that were as much about presence as they were about heat. It told you, without a word being spoken, that this was a home with enough to be warm, enough to be comfortable, and enough to add grace to the everyday. To me, those fireplaces will always stand as quiet reminders of what it meant to be rich in the 60s. Not because they kept you alive, but because they made life feel lovely while doing it. Another detail that marked a household as well off was the jewelry a mother wore. In most families I knew, a woman's wedding ring was her main treasure, a simple band or perhaps one with a modest stone that she wore every day with quiet pride. That ring was more than adornment. It was a promise, a symbol of devotion, and it was often the only fine piece she owned. Earrings, necklaces, or bracelets were rare in our circles, and if they appeared at all, they were usually borrowed for a special occasion or handed down from an older relative. Many women had a brooch or pin tucked in their jewelry box, often one that had belonged to a grandmother. But it wasn't something you saw every week. The idea of having a collection pieces chosen for beauty, matched carefully to dresses and shoes, was far beyond what most of us could imagine. But in some homes, the mothers seemed to step into church or into social gatherings as though they had been dressed straight from the pages of a magazine. I remember one neighbor who always caught my eye. One Sunday she arrived wearing a string of pearls that gleamed softly in the morning light, each bead perfectly round, the clasp at her neck sparkling just enough to let you know it was no imitation. Her earrings matched the necklace, and even her brooch pinned neatly to her coat seemed part of a set. On another Sunday, she wore a delicate bracelet, slim and gold, that glimmered every time she raised her hand to turn the page in her hymnal. I was transfixed, watching the way the light followed her movements, and though I never said a word, I thought to myself that this was the height of elegance. As a child, I didn't know the cost of such things, but I knew they weren't cheap. Jewelry like that spoke of security, of comfort, of a life where a husband's paycheck stretched far enough to cover more than food and bills. It was a sign that there was room for beauty and refinement, for spending money on something that wasn't necessary but made life brighter. And it wasn't just the jewelry itself. It was the way those mothers carried themselves when they wore it. Their handbags always seemed to match their shoes, polished until they shone, and their hair was styled in neat curls that framed their faces just so. They walked with a confidence that made them seem untouchable, as if they belonged to a world that operated by different rules than the rest of us. For my own mama, a Sunday dress was paired with plain clip-on earrings, or perhaps a pin she had owned since she was a girl, and her beauty came through in her smile and the way she sang. But sitting in those pews, I couldn't help comparing. I saw the way the pearls glowed, the way polished rings caught the sunlight as hymnal pages turned, and I felt the unspoken truth that jewelry, in those days, was more than decoration. It was a quiet announcement that life at home was steady, comfortable, and perhaps even a little glamorous. To me, those gleaming pearls and polished brooches were like lanterns, small signals of wealth that spoke not with words, but with shine. They were reminders that in the 60s, prosperity often revealed itself in subtle ways, tucked into the little details a child could spot without ever being told. Looking back now, I realize that wealth in the 60s showed itself in many small ways, and as children we noticed every one of them. Sometimes it was in the things you could see right from the curb. A polished car parked in the driveway that gleamed under the afternoon sun. A freshly trimmed lawn where the grass seemed greener and more carefully tended. Or a neat row of flower beds that looked like they had come straight from the gardening section of a magazine. Those outward signs spoke loudly in a quiet town. Without a word, they told you that the family inside had a little more than most, that they lived with comfort rather than constant worry. Other times, it was the things tucked quietly inside the home that marked them. A color television glowing in the corner of the living room, its screen showing bright worlds the rest of us could only imagine in black and white. A set of encyclopedias lined neatly across a shelf, promising answers to questions we didn't even know to ask. Or perhaps a holiday table laid with matching glassware, every piece catching the light in a way that made supper feel like a celebration rather than a meal. To a child, those things seemed like the very definition of being rich. They were the signals we learned to read without even trying. A second car in the garage, a freezer in the basement filled with ice cream, or a living room where the furniture matched instead of being pieced together over the years. Each one was a quiet whisper of security, comfort, and a life that ran just a little smoother. We didn't think about mortgages or bills or sacrifices. All we saw was the glow of the television, the sparkle of the silverware, the hum of an appliance that made life easier. Wealth, to our young eyes, was not measured in bank accounts. It was measured in the small details of everyday living that felt just out of reach for our own families. Yet, the older I grew, the more I came to see that not all wealth could be counted in possessions. The families who seemed the richest to me later in life weren't always the ones with the newest car or the fanciest curtains. They were the ones who helped neighbors during storms, shoveling snow from a driveway that wasn't their own or sharing a loaf of bread when supplies ran low. They were the families who welcomed friends to their tables, even when food was scarce, stretching casseroles and stews to make room for one more plate without complaint. They were the households where laughter filled rooms crowded with mismatched chairs, where comfort came not from polished things, but from the warmth of belonging. That kind of wealth wasn't written about in glossy magazines, and you couldn't buy it at the department store. It was built from kindness, generosity, and the steady rhythm of families who understood that what you gave away was often more important than what you kept. In the end, what set people apart wasn't just the money they had, but how they used it. Some used their resources to shine brighter than the rest, while others shared whatever they had to make life easier for those around them. Both kinds left their mark, but the kind I remember most fondly were the ones who gave warmth, not just heat, who made you feel welcome even when their homes were simple. For me, the richest moments of that time were never about things at all. They were about kindness freely offered, about family gathered close, about neighbors who showed up without needing to be asked. They were about the quiet comfort of knowing you belonged. Even if your car was old, your television black and white, and your towels plain and worn. Looking back now, that sense of belonging was the greatest treasure of all, and it's the one measure of wealth that has never gone out of style.